Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath, and we talk about executive function, our ability to manage our thoughts, emotions, actions, so that we can persist to pursue goals that are meaningful to us and those goals that serve our future selves. However, we are not living in this world alone. We are living with our friends, family, our communities, our nation, and global world. And most important thing we are also trying to figure out is how to be part of that global world and how to contribute to it. However, not every child's experience is made equal. There are a lot of factors that bring challenges, and when the child shows up to school and looks solemn, withdrawn, or irritable, there can be one approach where you say, "What's wrong? Hey, child, what's wrong with you?" Or there's a way to say, "Hey, what happened to you?" And this shift in the way we approach and take care of our children really is fueled by thoughts about the child having a very, very meaningfully different lives at home. So, I read somewhere that the individual human body that has been traumatized has been overwhelmed with stress, can feel helpless, reactive, angry, impulsive, rageful, numb, or even tending towards avoidance. And my guest says that is the same case, and same is true about schools. So schools and school districts that serve the needs of children and families who have endured trauma, they too, as a collective body, can feel helpless, can become reactive, angry, which can lead to combative encounters with each other. Their decisions can be impulsive. And lastly, they too can be riddled with avoidances. So we now know we have some pretty good methods in mental health and education to treat individuals as well as families with that kind of backdrop of knowledge. And it's not just an optional thing the way I see it. It's a mandatory, very, very essential ingredient to create opportunities for children to not just grow, but thrive and demonstrate resilience. So it is such a great pleasure to bring back, after begging and pleading, my dear, dear friend, Dave Melnick, to come and give us part two of the conversation we had last time. So those listeners who are tuning in just to this episode, there is one more additional treat for you. So definitely check out our previous episode just to get some additional backdrop of this conversation. But a little bit about Dave. So Dave Melnick is a LICSW. He's is a Co-Director of Outpatient Services at NFI, Vermont, a statewide mental health agency, primarily serving children, adolescents, and families. For past 35 years. He looks very young, so I don't know how he does this, but he says it's 35, so we'll take it. He has worked in a variety of settings, including outpatient, residential treatment, and in public and day treatment schools. Along with his focus on developmental trauma, Dave has expertise in family therapy, adolescence attachment, reflective practices, and trauma-informed systems. One last thing I would like to kind of point out that, Dave, he is not only a service, he takes care of children and schools, but he also trains. So he trains the trainers, and his knowledge is so deep and wide that there's incredible kindness and thoughtfulness, but more importantly, a desire and commitment to empowerment, which is what really speaks to me, because I think we need multiple Daves at multiple levels of educational tiers. So with that, I would like to welcome Dave to our podcast. How are you, Dave?
I'm really well, Sucheta. How are you today?
Excellent. And thank you for coming back. And I just realized it was very ambitious of us to cover everything that you know in one episode. But just to set the tone, I thought I'll kick off this conversation with this question about the two key terms that you laid out for us, which is trauma informed and trauma transformed. So can you just start there?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good place to start. And then I want to, in a moment or two, comment on what you said about the progression from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, because I want to give a slight minute or a half history on that and what I think is the most current evolution of that progression, which is, I'll state in a second. But what we talked about last time in very summary fashion is that organizations, schools, mental health agencies, child welfare offices, healthcare offices, have often three versions of responses when their staff and their client, patients, students, whatever the case may be, have been exposed to a lot of stress and strain and harm. And one of those, and the non-preferred that we touched on a little bit last time, is called trauma reactive. And in those organizations, those agencies, there's actually a succumbing by the workforce and by the leaders to the same kinds of symptoms that you mentioned that are often present for people, individual bodies and families that have been traumatized. So everything that is true about an individual that's experiencing traumatic stress can also be true on an organizational level. Organizations can become helpless. Organizations can become limited in their cognitive capacity. They can be reactive. They can become angry. They cannot hear one another. They can get easily frightened and risk averse. And so that's the non-preferred version of what happens to an organization when they are around and try to heal or educate through traumatic experiences and traumatic exposures. The second in the continuum, going from trauma inducing to trauma reducing, is what is commonly now referred to as trauma informed. And I try to give a very quick definition of that, which really boils down to, in order to be a trauma-informed person and a trauma-informed organization, you have to know the science of trauma, which is pretty substantial, although very easily understandable to anybody that works with and raises children. You have to have an understanding of the 4 R's that we went over: the realize, recognize, respond, and resist, re-traumatization. And importantly, that being trauma informed means that you're being responsive to the potential negative impacts that trauma can have on individual bodies and collections of bodies, like occur in classrooms and in hallways and in schools. The final version, which is both aspirational and attainable, I have got to believe that this is attainable, even though I'm just beginning to see versions of this in different organizations around the country, is trauma transformed. And what's different about trauma transformed than trauma informed is that although it also has clinical components, it is centrally a political movement. It is about prevention. It's our work to try to make sure that we are preventing harm being perpetrated against our kids, our families, our community members, our teachers, our principals, our bus drivers, and anybody associated, really anybody in the human species. The focus is on how do we prevent that.
I think this your summary just reminds me of Sandra Bloom. She's a physician who is the creator of the sanctuary model, and she talks about this, that trying to implement trauma-specific clinical practices without first implementing trauma-informed organizational culture change is like throwing seeds on dry land. So you're just pointing out that I think it is not a child that we are taking care of; it's the systems that are taking care of children. So both.
Yes, and that we talked last time about an important, like the developmental model that we use in family therapy or as family therapists, is that if caregivers are reasonably good shape, if the people raising children are reasonably well, that gives the child the best chances of being well. And just basic kind of trickle down that when primary caregivers are doing well, they have lots and lots of things to offer kids, the things that kids need in order to thrive and heal when necessary. I'm glad, Sucheta, that you brought up Dr. Bloom, because that connects so beautifully from what you said before. She is long credited with the expression, that progression of what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and that her belief is that many of us in the clinical world, and myself included, were trained in models that focused to some degree on pathology and deficit, and that the central approach, one of the central approaches for me as a social worker and in Dr. Bloom's work, is to focus much more on asset and strength and ability. So the progression now is much more representative as let's move from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, to what is it about you that enabled you to survive the way
Wow.
that you survived that adversity. So it's much more directed around asset-based and strength-based, because I often talk with kids and families, certainly about the things perpetrated against them, but I'm more interested in the elements, the personal elements, the cultural elements, the familial elements, the community elements that actually promoted healing, and in many cases, natural healing that does not necessarily have to be outsourced to a mental health provider or a teacher or a speech and language therapist or an occupational therapist. There's lots of healing that goes on and has gone on spontaneously and organically that we have not done a good job professionally recognizing.
No, thank you for making that connection back. And as we proceed to the next deeper dive about the process and the methods, I just wanted to see if am I getting it correctly. So when we talk about one of the things which you answered my question, which was going to be, do we even understand the term trauma? People who are trying to take care of it, do they understand what it is? So is it because there is, or have we come to conclusion that there is a universal definition of trauma, and are there are examples of trauma, but it's not limited to, which is experiencing or observing physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, which could be a childhood neglect. There could be having family members with mental health and substance abuse disorders, so a lot of instability in the members who a family who take care of the children, experiencing or witnessing violence in the community, and also poverty and systemic discrimination.
Yes.
So are these good?
Yeah.
Is this a good list to begin with when we think about trauma?
I think those are the list of things that are potentially traumatizing events or immersive and relentless experiences. So I think there's much more agreement on the conditions that might lead to trauma, and there's much less consensus about what trauma actually is in terms of describing what trauma is. I think what I was trying to clarify the last time that we talked is that as a clinical concern, trauma largely is something that is distinguished by something that overwhelms your ability to cope and has potential long-term effect on your biological, emotional thinking and action systems. That beta
Yes.
acronym that I used last time. So to me, the two things that are important about trauma as a condition, as a potential impact area, is if the experience overwhelms your ability to cope. Not all abusive situations overwhelm. Not all physical assaults overwhelm a person's ability to cope. That it is both the inability to cope and the longer lasting effect that I think distinguishes what trauma is as a clinical concern, as a parenting concern, as an educational concern.
Great. So with that now, maybe you can talk to us about the key practices that you recommend us to use to help foster growth and healing.
Okay, so that's great. So there's two premises that I think are important to cover before I go into the more fundamental question that you're asking. One premise is that I don't believe that everybody through this pandemic, that not everybody has been harmed, or that not everybody is unwell, and that not everybody has been injured by the pandemic in the last 2.5 years. We know, you and I know, that whenever there's a community crisis, it's always disproportionate in its impact, and it tends to always harm people on the margins. The effect that I've experienced from the pandemic is so much less than people that don't have the resources and the advantages and the privileges that I have. And so I think that's an important premise, that lots of people today and even pre-pandemic have been unwell, injured, harmed by the list of things that you said before, by abuse, neglect, deprivation, domestic violence, parental substance addictions, racism, sexism, classism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, all those things are harmful and potentially harmful conditions. But I do take it as a part of the premise of our conversation that many people right now are unwell, and that many people have been harmed and hurt and impacted and injured and wounded by the last 2.5 years. That is particularly true of anybody that works in schools and attends schools. So I think you're hard pressed to find people that have been completely unscathed. So that's the first premise that I'm operating under today,
Yes.
and until we fully heal from this pandemic and other ills and harms in our communities. The second premise is a formula that I use almost absolutely routinely anytime I talk to groups of educators, parents, mental health professionals, child welfare workers, anybody that has a love and professional interest in children. I'm going to talk about this formula. And the formula, and I'll ask people that have the capacity to write it down as I narrate it, is it looks like a math formula, but I'm going to turn it into more of a psychological formula. And what it looks like is if you're willing to draw it, as I say it, think about a math formula that has a circle plus a circle plus a circle equaling a square. So circle plus circle plus circle equals square. If you write it large enough, if you're listening and are able to write it down, then write it large enough, because I'll ask you to draw, to write some words in each one of these, and to almost do like a mini diagram about this. In the first circle, if you'd put student behavior or student conduct or student actions. And then in the square, so right at the end, and I'm sorry, there should be an equal sign. So circle plus circle plus circle equals square. In the square, if you would write in the square, outcomes, student outcomes, consequences. So the first circle is student behavior. The last square on the other side of the equal sign is outcomes. What a traditional belief system is about children is that what children do in a classroom, in the hallway, in the ball field, that there's a direct line almost. So if you drew almost a line and forgot those other circles, drew like a curved line from that first circle to the square, that's the way many people that work with schools and raise children believe about kids. A kid backtalks, the consequence is you get sent out of a class. The kid puts their head down on the desk, they get a 0 on their assignment. What's problematic about that linear cause and effect model is it completely discounts two other highly relevant factors that are impactful on the overall outcome of and consequences, really the outcome of a child's behavior. So in the first circle, what a child does. I believe that children, regardless of what's happened to them, have some accountability for their behavior. That the only way I can imagine to run a civil society is to hold people accountable, even when you've been harmed. The way that we hold people that have been traumatized accountable, though, is going to be different than the way you would hold a typically developed child that doesn't have the adverse exposures that many of the students that I work with, most of the students that I work with have. Does that make sense so far, Sucheta?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I can't wait for the other circles, if I may just interject. But I think it's such a colloquial wisdom. It is that people come or their bodies and minds show up in the classrooms to learn, and they're supposed to learn no matter what the barriers they have encountered. And it's almost the position is, and it's just a cultural change, I feel, last 100 years.
Yeah, and that's what I'm promoting.
Because
and that's the right word.
Because I remember even like simple thing, my mother who lives with me, and she just turned 80, and it's a funny conversation with her about her schooling experience. And, a standard practice was a teacher would have a stick. And if you even no eraser was given to a child because eraser means bad. And you just got beatings. Like that was literally as you mentioned, student, outcomes, or actions and outcomes were thought to be as a straight line. So bad outcome is you're bad. Good outcome Uh-huh.
How does your mom talk about that experience? Like what's the flavor of the tone of how she reflects on that?
It is very interesting, and if I may indulge in like two experiences, but um, I think, and it's also very, very mixed feeling because you come from India where guru or teacher is considered the top of the top. The teacher is close to God. And so teaching or being in the company of a teacher is considered a cultural privilege. And so there's a wonderful way you relate to education. There's a lot of respect. But also the teacher's intolerance or your infractions is considered your disrespect towards not just the teacher, but the teaching process. And so that disrespect needs to be brought online by punishment. So there's a very concrete way of thinking. So as she relates, one is she feels she must have done something. It was her mistake, right? Yeah. So that's how she processed it and internalized. It was never the teacher lacks patience or the teacher actually is unkind, was never in the picture. And second thing is also, I was telling my mother this recently, like her resilience, she was left-handed and it was beaten out of her. And she became right-handed and she continues to sew with left hand. She's ambidextrous and she never looks at it as being gifted. You know what I mean? So that there's a lost opportunity to me that a child who has become an adult has gone through these amazing adjustments and skills. How many people are ambidextrous, right? That she has never given herself any credit. So that's the kind of a byproduct. I don't know if you were thinking about that or not.
Yeah. But I think it sounds like what you described as minimally some ambivalence about it. On the one hand, it hardened and toughened her and allowed her to develop these resilience and these new capacities. On the other hand, what got lost in the suppression of her own ideas, her own style of wanting to do something, the message that she was bad, perhaps for not following exactly what was expected of her. So it sounds like she can represent both possibilities or both experiences.
And I'll say that's true about me too. I mean, I don't know if I qualify for childhood trauma experiences, but my traumas were all about, my ideas were never respect-worthy. They were always disruptive and they were creating a disruption in the flow of how things were supposed to unfold. So questioning was taken as you being actually, your actions are disruptive. And so it's just and I don't know about girls and boys distinction here, but I internalize that as something is wrong with me. Why do I want to challenge anything? Why can't I just go along with things?
Yeah. And Sucheta, that to me is such a fundamental experience of people that are harmed in all different kinds of ways, whether you name it trauma or you may name it adversity, that one of the designs of small children is they are oriented towards self-blame. Than they are blaming the person that might be perpetrating harm on them. The capacity to externalize the blame happens much later in development. But young children carry around the artifacts of feeling like there's something wrong with them, or else their parent wouldn't be hurting them or their teacher wouldn't be humiliating them. Making sense of it cognitively and placing responsibility where it really should be happens later on for children, oftentimes after a fair amount of collateral damage has occurred for that child.
And maybe you can make a quick comment here. Why are we using these motivational mechanisms? Humiliation seems to be like a belief. If I pick on you, you will straighten out. So because you would not like to be picked on, but if I say it to you kindly, you might take advantage of my kindness and never improve. There's that some perverse way of thinking that reprimanding leads to more tight self-control or self-regulation. Do you have any thoughts about that? Why we go with that wisdom versus what actually works?
Yeah, I think, and we talked very briefly, at least we mentioned the book, My Grandmother's Hands. And I think there is as good a tracing of the history in this country, in the United States, of who came here and what they were carrying with them, some of the child rearing practices, that although the people that came here might have been rebelling against certain conditions from where they came, but they came also with a fairly high level of of kind of unrecognized pedagogy when it comes to child rearing practices, and that here we are hundreds of years, as the white settlers, the people that colonized, and still not completely having done our work on separating from our roots and how we even look at children, how children are still viewed and the things that we can rationalize in doing to children, because there's still at least a notion that they are not individuated humans, that they are to be under the command of adults. And so the more that we command children, the more that we will raise children that will then command their children, that we know that there's an intergenerationality in parenting styles, and that it often takes somebody disruptive or rebellious to say, I'm not sure this is going to work. This is working for me, and that I'm going to carry this forward in the next generation. So in terms of this formula, one of the things that I really push back on is that I'm not saying that there aren't antecedents to kids' behavior, and I'm not saying that kids are not ultimately accountable for certain things. But what I am saying that is that in the second circle, so in the first circle, we have child behavior. In the second circle, we have adult response. And my claim is that how adults respond to child's behavior, so how the adult in circle 2 responds to what a child does, is as relevant, is as vital, and is as important, if not more so, than what the kid did. So my belief, my observation, and I think there's plenty of data to support this, that how an adult responds to what a kid does is as critical as what the kid did, including a kid back-talking you, threatening another kid, kicking a hole in the wall, that how we respond has as much to do with the outcome as what the child did. And that's often not the way that many people see the world. In fact, when I say that without further explanation, there's hands that get raised very quickly saying, well, you blaming me for what the child does? And in my head, what I say is, of course, I'm not blaming you, but of course, I'm holding you co-responsible, that you are a co-author. You co-construct the outcomes, whether you're a mom or dad, an auntie or uncle, a school teacher, a principal, a coach. The way that you respond, particularly to problematic behavior, absolutely has an impact on the outcome. And I think that is incredibly provable, what I'm saying. And I think the proof is rather simple. Follow a middle school kid around. Follow a kid that you watch in first period class that is defiant to their teacher, but that teacher happens to be trauma informed and has a good relationship with that kid. And watch how artfully and gracefully that human being handles defiant behavior, to the point where the outcomes end up being pretty good because of the talent level and the experience level of that workforce member. Follow that kid to the second period class where the teacher's not trauma informed. Same behavior emerges. The kid becomes defiant. I'm not doing this. This is stupid. You can't make me. And the teacher matches the intensity of the kid and says, if you raise your voice, if you don't, and begins to threaten, humiliate, raise their voice, to the point where the kids, co-escalates with the teacher. And then all of a sudden you have a kid getting bounced out of class, not because of the defiance singularly, but because of the combination of the defiance and the response of the adult.
Wow.
But one of the things that is most problematic in families and in schools and in therapy is that we spend a lot of time in schools, and I'll say this with some irony in my voice, Sucheta, but I mean it seriously, is I think we spend too much time in schools talking about kids and curriculum. I think when we spend all of the available adult to adult time in schools, spending time just talking primarily about kids and curriculum, we lose any possibility of speaking about this second circle, how our response system directly impacts. And I think it's an equity issue. And I think it's an equity issue because if we spend all this time in schools when we just have adult time together, and all that time is distributed to surveilling and deconstructing and analyzing children, then we are saying that children are the problem.
Yeah.
And the equity issue becomes then we are taking no responsibility or little responsibility for our own ethnicity, our own race, our own culture, our own bias, our own beliefs, our own pedagogy, our own conditioning and socialization as a kid, and saying that's not relevant here at all. And I think that's hugely problematic.
Wow. And, it's from the executive function lens, I feel We talk a lot about that put your mask on first before you help people, but I feel you polish your mirror first before you offer other person
Yes.
to look in to a mirror that is not polished, you know?
Yeah.
So I think
Yes.
that lack of
Yes.
self-awareness to me is a profound gap, because you're certifying yourself to be fully competent in your ability to respond with patience, kindness, reflective stance. And also, I think, are you taking perspective on that child from a child's perspective? That is such an essential ingredient.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's critical what you said, and we'll circle back to it in a little while about the capacity. I think we have so many different lenses by which we look at children that are good. We have theories and science and like we have all these lenses, and that's great. But I think what you just said, that the most important tool to me to work with and raise children is a mirror and not a lens.
Yeah.
And that we need not only the mirrors that we hold up to ourselves, because those are limited. You can't see the back of your head. You need a friend or somebody to help you see the things that you don't see in yourself. And so for that, in order to really optimize our capacity as adults working with and raising children, is we need people that will reveal to us the things that we don't see about ourselves, because that's where dangerous things happen between adults and children, is when adults are acting in an unexamined way,
Oh,
where they're not examining their own experience, their own triggers. I'm all for talking to kids about their triggers and antecedents. And here where I think is where the real equity issue is. I think it's patently unfair that we ask 5, 7, 9, 14, 16-year-old kids incredibly rigorous questions about what they just did with functional behavioral analysis and ABAs and all. We ask kids incredibly rigorous questions about themselves, which I'm fine with, provided the adults are doing the same.
yeah. Zero self-reflection.
And
Yeah.
Zero. And so often when I start asking questions, it's amazing how vulnerable and fragile adults are when I ask very basic questions about their conduct and their behavior and their antecedents and their triggers. Because those things, if we're going to ask kids that, we owe it to children, particularly children that have been traumatized, we owe it to them that we're doing as rigorous self-examination as we're asking them to do it. And if we're not, that's an inequitable system, and we're actually harming kids.
And can I probe this right here? Something wonderful you said. It comes back to this foundational understanding of when people get together under a roof of schooling. There is this inherent belief that I teach, you learn. So somehow there has to be some sort of submission. There has to be,
Yes.
I don't want to say I'm the king, but I have knowledge and I have a way to impart the knowledge, and you need to become a vessel. And that vessel, if it's empty, only then I can fill. So there is a little
Yeah.
bit of a assumption that it's not equal. Teaching and
Yeah.
learning are not equal, is not done on an equal footing. And I'm wondering, as I'm listening to you, maybe we are getting that wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the most progressive, disruptive, innovative, and excellent teachers are the ones that truly don't just give lip service to the idea that they are learners as much as they are teachers.
Mm.
But I do think that that's absolutely where we're heading in lots and lots of places, where when I walk into classrooms and I see the level of creativity, when I see teachers circling up with kids and truly working the spirit of, I have as much to learn here, and if I listen very carefully to kids, I'll become a better instructor. If I'm a better listener and a better learner, and if I keep myself kind of present in the learning experience, I can't but become a better teacher.
So
So
amazing, very powerful.
and in this formula, so we got a third circle we got to get to in a second, but I linger on this second circle, and I make as strong appeal as I can that teachers that are highly reactive to child behavior always struggle with child behavior. When you are as reactive as the kid is impulsive, that's a problem. The only time that an adult human being has to respond quickly to a child is if there's imminent aggression. In every other circumstances that I can think of, deliberation, intentionality, exhaling, mindfulness will always breed better outcomes. And so again, I think it's ironic that sometimes I consult with teachers and in my head I'm thinking, wow, you're as impulsive as the impulsive kid. That's a problem. Like you can't join the kid's rapid pace with your response unless, again, there's somebody that's about to be harmed. And in fact, the teachers that I watch that are exuding excellence, they're the ones that when there is a behavioral concern in the classroom, they take a fair amount of time to address it, and that what's communicated to the other kids is confidence. Because one of the things that you communicate to children very quickly by responding impulsively, one of the things that you communicate to children is that you are anxious and that you are not in charge. The faster you respond to certain kinds of behaviors, the more likely you're communicating to the kids, oh, we can get to Mr. Melnick. Look, we got him all wound up. He's struggling. He's off balance here. And not that, the kids are going to be intentionally predatory, but they're looking to feel safe. And if I'm highly reactive, that doesn't feel safe to kids. And so the work of trauma transformation is fundamentally a top-down notion. We've got to get the workforce in a much more relaxed, less reactive, and a reflective place where they understand that part of this outcome formula rests firmly on their shoulders. Because the final thing I'll say about this second circle, adult response, is I've been a child therapist for 35, 38 years. It's really hard to change people, other people. The most effective way to change a child, whether it's your own child or it's your student, is to change yourself. It is much more efficient, it's much more effective, and it's much more likely to have outcomes. The teachers that I work with that become trauma-informed and successful are the ones that are, again, Sucheta, holding the multiple mirrors up. And they're developing methods amongst their colleagues where they're talking more about themselves and what's coming up for them, working with kids that have challenges, than they are poking constantly during their department meetings around how do we work with this kid? How do we fix? The most inefficient thing to do is to try to talk about 10 kids in a 45-minute block that you're worried about. The most effective thing is to talk about one kid and your response to that kid and how you can shape and control and change and adapt how you're working with that kid. And then the third circle that impacts outcome is, of course, context. And context includes everything that would come to mind from anybody listening right now. Context would include where's the behavior happening? When's it happening? Is it in the classroom? Is it in the hallway? Is it at bedtime? Is it in the middle of the day? If you're a parent, that context includes what's the nature of your relationship with that kid. Because the better the relationship you have, the more contextual issues and the more rights I have to try certain things with kids if I have a really good relationship. But context also includes, I am, most people listening won't be able to see me. I'm a white, straight, cisgendered, middle-class man. I'm 6'2" tall. And that if I don't carry, and I said this a little bit last time, if I don't carry that knowledge into every interaction that I have with people, that's a problem. That's a contextual issue. That for many of the youth that I work with, kids that are in the BIPOC community, kids that are in the queer community, that I automatically represent something that's harmful for them. And if I don't contextually understand that, then I am creating conditions under which I am contributing to their harm.
Wow. So many thoughts are circling in my head as I think about your third circle. Context. I think I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about, so there is the context in terms of the cultural context, what's your relationship to the group? You may be a minority teacher in a majority group versus vice versa. It could be time of the day. I had Daniel Pink talking about his book, When, which is our biochemistry is different during different parts of the day where, a child who's hungry, who may be hangry, and that could be a simple reason that child is misbehaving. You could be hungry and
Absolutely.
angry.
If you have a third grade student that you have for most of the day, and that kid is learning reasonably optimally 11 o'clock in the morning, and then by 1 o'clock in the afternoon the kid is surly, defiant, mouthy, it could be about blood sugar, it could be about tiredness, it could be about what I really focus on, what happened on the playground.
Yes.
Because when I hear a teacher say, it's the same kid, Dave, why was he learning at 11 and why not at 1? I say he's not the same kid. Because if the stress level changed, if the kid was bullied or harmed or hurt or saw a sibling and was reminded of something that happened at home the night before, then it's not the same kid. It's a different version of the same kid. And that we have to recognize that there might have been something in the child's stress experience that now has them leading so they're presenting in a very different way in the classroom.
I think this reminds me of like I think what kind of person you are. Person who has done the self-work, a person who is mature, person who has experienced something called motivational maturation. That means your motivations are not to control and squish everything, but just allow things to thrive. I like to think about a visual when I talk to educators is you're a tree under which children are seeking shade. So you can decide what kind of tree it is, because if it's too shady, then nothing grows under shade, right? And if it's too tall and thin and has no leaves, then there's no shade, So just the right amount of shade. How do you decide that? That means how do you make children feel that they're safe with you, but they also are ready to take academic and interpersonal risks, which is what learning is all about.
In your world, in your expertise around executive functioning, I think I know the answer to this, but I don't know for sure. Is it fair for me to assume as a non-expert in executive functioning that relationships enhance executive functioning amongst kids? If I have a good relationship and I'm the second grade teacher, I might get better executive functioning from a kid that I have a really good relationship with, or does it not work that way?
Oh, absolutely. Primarily because we tend to self-regulate if there is a social presence. That means we are likely to regulate. This is a gross example, but it is like the things you will do in an elevator when you're by yourself versus one person enters the elevator and you suddenly shape up. That's social regulation. And that's what executive function allows you to do. Nudges you to regulate yourself because your behavior, actions, and your expression of thoughts and emotions influences other people. And that awareness makes you better.
Yes. So in terms of that's just a formula. And again, it's a second premise. One premise is there's lots of unwell people. Second premise is part of my job is I've got to convince people that this formula is the most relevant way to understand outcomes, and that we can't continue to shoulder kids by filling out behavior plans and various different plans that exist in schools, because I think it says to the kids exactly opposite of what you said before. I think absent some really careful and considerate planning, I think many kids fill out behavior plans and the interpretation they make is there's something wrong with me. Because look who fills out behavior plans in this classroom. The kids, the kids know who the behavior plan kids are. So there's an automatic potential negative feedback loop on that.
So Dave, how do we manage all this? I know you have a very thoughtful way that you recommend us to approach this process. So how should we go about it?
Yeah, so going back to the premise of unwellness, injury, harm, wounding through trauma, and how that wounds bodies and collective bodies and communities and organizations and schools and things like that, that we use a metaphor with some level of detail that I'll just touch on just so people can leave with a sense around that. And the metaphor is that in order to address when unwellness and illness and injury and wounding has become big enough, sometimes we need medicine to take care of that. And so the metaphor is that in order to heal organizations that have been harmed by trauma, that we think about medicine and a delivery system. That medicine without a delivery system. So if you think about having medicine but no way of getting it into the people's mouths and arms, then the medicine doesn't do any good. So I'll just name what the 5 ingredient components of the medicine are that we use, and they can be different. Different organizations, different people would say my medicine's different. The components of what we use to help heal people is different. That's fine. And then the 6-step delivery system is like it's from implementation sciences. How do you get these good medicines into the people that need them? So the 5 ingredients for us and they change even from when you and I met a couple of years ago. I've changed one of them. The first one, and Sujata, you tell me if there's any detail. I'll just name them, and then if you want some detail on them.
That sounds great.
A little bit of detail, or just name them.
Well, I think a little bit detail will also help.
Okay, so the first ingredient in the medicine is that we believe that everybody that works with and raises children needs to have an understanding of stress. And so we go into a fair amount of detail of understanding, and we use this progression of terms around stress, that it's about detection, connection, and mitigation. And what that means is that in order to be effective in moderating stress, and in this case, post-traumatic stress that can impact an individual person or collective of people, that in order to get to mitigation, you've got to detect it first. You've got to know how it's impacting you. And so we spend a lot of time in our work teaching people, adults, to get really good at detecting different stress states in their own bodies and being able to, in a very granular level, know the difference between stress states that are helpful and stress states that are harmful. One of the notions that many people carry, popular notions, is that stress is bad. And that's not the case. Stress is inherently neither good nor bad. It depends. Whether stress is positive and productive or negative and harmful depends on the amount of stress, the frequency of stress, the type of stress, the age or developmental stage you are at.
Yeah.
It depends on the escapability of the stress. When you can't escape the stress, that is more harmful than stress that you can get away from. So those factors and the overall capacity to be able to detect where you are on the stress continuum, which is what we teach. We show these beautiful slides around the stress continuum and the stress curve. The second notion is around connection. And that notion is that if you work with and raise children, it is highly likely that the stress that you are experiencing and the stress that you are enduring will not get erased by self-care, that there is not enough self-care time in your life to be able to completely mitigate. One of the things that we push back on in our world of stress is that stress should be community property. It should not be individualized and privatized the way it is in our culture, that stress is your problem. We don't believe that in trauma transformation. We believe that your stress, Sucheta, if you and I were working together in a school, your stress would be certainly some of your responsibility to mitigate, but it would also be my responsibility. That your stress, like my stress, is community property. It is a team sport to address it and not an individual endeavor alone. So
I really like that, by the way, Dave. I think it's such a profound way. It's like a universal hug, putting arms around every individual in the community so they're never alone. I really think it'll change our world if we do that.
I think if we really saw stress as community property and stopped individualizing and pathologizing, there is not a diagnosis in DSM-5R that is not impacted and precipitated by stress. There is not one.
100%. 100%.
Right. That you could have conditions that, genetic, that you were born with that are going to be made worse if you're in heightened levels of stress. So we talk about, again, detecting it, connecting with one another, and having methods and means and measures by which every family, every workforce, every work group, every classroom has means by which they are connecting with one another, so we can then accomplish the third step, which was around mitigation, the kinds of stress that's most harmful. One of the things, and then I'll move on to the next one because I could talk for hours about stress. One of the things that we find incredibly important, particularly when you work with educators, is that there is often an unwritten rule that you suppress negative stress if you're an educator, that you inhibit it, you suppress it, it's your problem, check it at the door, don't let it out. And one of the things that we know, both by the ACEs study, but we knew it before that, we know that when you suppress negative stress states, it does not metabolize in your body, it metastasizes. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And we know that stress will reveal itself either with your permission or without your permission.
So powerful.
And so stress can reveal itself with your permission when you exercise, when you meditate, when you do yoga, when you break bread with friends, when you talk about and download your day with your partner. That's letting stress out with your permission. When we overly suppress it, it will come out without our permission if we don't have methods by which we mitigate it. And we all know the ways that stress comes out without our permission. We humiliate other people. We lose our temper. We're impatient. We're harmful. We're mean. We're unkind. We're short-tempered, all those kinds of things. So lots more we could talk about at some point, maybe about stress. The second key ingredient you already named earlier, Sucheta, is reflective practice. That we believe that you certainly have to read books about kids, and you have to understand executive functioning and learning style and personality theory and mood and all those. Like, there's lots of lenses by which to understand the landscape, and the landscape being kids and families and what we can see out there. But reflective practice is, as we talked about earlier today, I believe it's far more important and far more relevant to outcomes, whether they're educational outcomes or their mental health outcomes or well-being outcomes, that we have methods and means and measures by which our workforce can reflect together in groups no larger than 6 people on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. That we spend time analyzing, deconstructing, surveilling, and understanding ourselves, our own antecedents and triggers and conditioning and socialization, and to the best of our ability, make sure that we are examining those factors so we can have the most control over outcomes with kids when we're most clear about who we are and why we do what we do, not who the kid is and why they do what they do. There are too many kids with too many complicated presentations to be experts in all the kinds of kids.
Yes.
So
such a good point.
So reflective practice is be an expert on you. If you're an expert on you, you will automatically learn what you need to learn about people that you don't know or you don't understand.
And if I can just interject here, one of the challenges to this reflective practices is you need strong executive function to be able to reflect.
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges that I talk in my circles that we want children to take responsibility for their own learning when we don't take responsibility for our own teaching.
Yes.
And your lack of self-awareness can be very harmful to children because your assumption is, I teach so you learn.
Yes.
But what if you fail to teach the way student learns, you never reflect on it, then it never becomes part of your self-corrective process.
It's critical. I may have said this last time, but it bears reiterating that there is no such thing as self-awareness without information from other people. There's just so much you can know about yourself that other people know you differently than you know yourself. That doesn't mean they know you better. They know you differently. And the information that other people have about us often can be incredibly important in our own capacity to improve our quality of teaching, counseling, parenting, whatever it is that we do. So that reflective practice, and often what ends up happening in schools is, the concern around we don't have time for that. It is much more, and there's research to back up what I'm about to say, there is much more effective learning that happens in an hour a month of reflecting with your colleagues on your beliefs, your assumptions, your relationship with kids than there is in 6 hours of professional development where somebody like me comes and speaks at people. That there is a robust amount of knowledge and research that says reflective practice enhances the learning of our workforce far more effectively and efficiently than standard professional development. The third ingredient, and I'll just run through these other ones. The third ingredient is the capacity to reframe. And what reframing, everybody knows what reframing is conceptually. How it's used here is that oftentimes people get a fixed notion of behaviors, particularly problematic behaviors, and they often put a singular label on what is really a very complex set of conditions and behaviors that the kid might be expressing. So reframing is the capacity to have multiple explanations for what appears to be a singular behavior. And it rests on the notion, reframing rests on the notion, one of the notions that what you see selectively. Because you and I, Sucheta, could be watching the same news program, and we could both have different labels on what we're watching. And so we know that what we see is a construction a social construction based on your gender, your sexual orientation, your conditioning, your race, your socioeconomic status, that what you see literally is impacted by who you are. There is certainly objective truths, but more truths are subjective. And so reframing is living with the reality, living in the both and world. I can comfortably work with a child and say they are both defiant and incredibly self-protective and tenacious. I can live in both worlds. And in fact, I am more effective in working with defiant kids because I recognize that the minute you label something, you limit it. The minute you put a label on something, you limit it. Now, labels are great. I mean, we professionally, you and I, we need limits. We need labels because there's an efficiency. You say somebody has an executive functioning challenge to me, and you can say 3 words, and I got some ideas about what you're saying. But we have to look at the flip side of labeling, which is the moment you label it, you limit it, and you potentially kill curiosity and wondering what else could this be.
And your own exploration about what other things may be mitigating or influencing.
Yes.
Because that label has such strong boundaries.
Right. Exactly. And that's where the limiting comes in. And so an example of reframing I gave is that the most trauma-informed human beings are the one that can be working with a child and living in the both and world, a child that's being very defiant. No, I'm not doing this. You can't make me, Mr. Melnick. I hate you. You're not so-and-so. You can't make me do anything. So when kids get their back up against the wall, they're defiant, they're avoidant, they're putting their heads down on the desk, they're refusing to do tasks. I have great success with those kids, as many of the teachers do that I work with, because they're really good at seeing the both and. What else is this child doing besides being defiant? Because I would argue that what they're also doing is they're being determined. They're being self-protective. They're being passionate about their own beliefs. They're setting a limit on me because I'm probably asking them to do something that is evoking a feeling that they don't like.
It's I know you're on a roll here. I just quickly reminded me of a story I read this past weekend by I think Sam Anderson in New York Times, and it was about I think the story was called "I Have Always Struggled with My Weight. Losing it didn't mean winning." And the story is literally about this reframing that he goes through. He has struggled with his weight, and he goes through his visit his father who passes away, and his T-shirts. He looks at them, who was a runner, and then he looks at his own relationship to food, and he says, and at the end he just concludes that I'm not overeating. I'm curious and I explore the world through food. In addition to, it was just such a wonderfully written article. You know what I mean? So I think we need those kinds of little nudges so that we can heal from our own obsessive or erroneous or not such good methods or whatever we want to call it. But we need that reframing process.
You said one of the crucial things about reframing and why it works as a mindset and as a strategy, and that is that if you look at a child and you call them defiant, that shapes the interaction. It shapes your tone, your emotion as the adult, your affect tone, what the kid can read from you. And when you reframe it, what you're actually doing is you're communicating in a different affect state with the kid, because most of us don't feel the same about a determined kid or a self-protected kid as we do about a defiant kid. And so when we change the language, it's not just some clever language shift. It is intended to change our experience of that behavior. When we change our experience and our perception of it, the child will feel it. It will feel like we're collaborative instead of critical towards them. The fourth, and I know we're running shy,
we are running. So maybe we can cover these 5, and that'll be great for today. But yes, tell us about the number 4 and 5.
So the fourth ingredient is relationality. Relational. I use the word relationality because it's an underused word. People use relationship. I really want to get people's attention when I say relationality, because it's really about the art and science of how we develop relationships with people.
I love that term.
That we know. And we know from our own life experience, and we also know from the research and literature, that the singular most important tool in affecting change with another human being is a relationship.
Yes.
I'm not an engineer. I don't have a lot of fancy tools to do my work. The primary tool that all of us use when we're effective is the ability to form and maintain and sustain a relationship with somebody, particularly somebody that has been harmed and hurt in relationships. It's hard to develop a relationship with somebody that has prior experiences. That relationship represent harm and hurt and abuse and all those kinds of things. So relationality is, and I will partially quote Maya Angelou because I think it's particularly pertinent to this ingredient in the medicine of transforming trauma. Longer quote, but essentially Maya Angelou talks about that people will forget what you say and did, but they won't forget how you made them feel. When I'm interacting with a kid and that child is struggling, they may not remember a word about what I'm saying, but they will remember what it felt like to be with me. Did it feel honoring and kind? Did it feel humiliating? Did it feel like I was trying to use my power to outmaneuver or to harm them? They may not remember a moment of what I said, but they will remember the body tone feel, and that's critical. And so part of what we talk about in this fourth ingredient is how do we maximize our capacity to develop relationships, recognizing that many of the kids that we're most worried about are experiencing relational poverty. And what they need most is enhancement, is they need 2 or 3 trustworthy, reliable relationships as a precondition to learning. Relationships
Love that.
for all kids is a precondition for learning. Most kids arrive at school with those relationships intact, so they don't necessarily need them with their teacher. They benefit from them. And then the fifth area is co-care, community care. And so as an ingredient to transform trauma, what co-care is, many people have heard the term, it is the more important older sibling of self-care. And so I'm a big fan of self-care. I think self-care is a necessary component to human well-being. It is not sufficient. There is not enough time in the day. There is not enough access to take care of yourself for you to be a completely well human being. In fact, that's not how evolution has taught us that we have survived all these hundreds of thousands of years. We've survived as a species primarily because we're really good at caring for one another.
Yeah.
Not because we take bubble baths or because we go on a jog. Those are important. I don't mean to put those down.
Yes.
But what co-care is that it is the responsibility of the community, a school, a mental health agency, a classroom, to figure out together how are we going to take care of one another. Co-care is about how do we take care of one another. So self-care, necessary but not sufficient, community care. And so one last thing I'll say about many people that are listening probably work for organizations that promote self-care, and they even have apps and contests of who gets the most steps, and that stuff's fine, except when organizations promote self-care in the absence of providing co-care, what the organization is doing for their workforce, then self-care becomes weaponized. And it becomes weaponized in this form of, if you're not well, employee, it's because you're not doing enough self-care. You're not taking good care of yourself, and it's a bit patronizing. So self-care, when it is promoted singularly by a workplace without also saying, hey, workforce, this is how we're taking care of you. Without that second more important component, then we often have a implicit way that we're blaming people when they're not well at work.
You know, I think as I'm listening to you, it's just I'm not coming from a place of discouragement, but I'm thinking there's so many opportunities for people to change the way we educate care providers, educate and prepare our teachers, educate and prepare children or college-going young adults to become these participants in society as contributing members. Because why limit this to trauma-informed, trauma-transformed approaches to highly stressed contexts? Every single workplace is highly stressed context. every single interaction at home, if you don't keep check, requires reframing. I
Yes.
mean, I think
Yeah.
just why not learn about this? So as we close, Dave, do you have any thoughts about how can we take these wonderful nuggets of information and apply to universal way of becoming these human beings who have very safe collective nations, or is that too grandiose a thought at this point?
Yeah, I have friends and colleagues that are so good at thinking globally and then acting locally. I'm thinking I have been amazed and humbled by the schools that I work with in Vermont and New York and in parts of Canada that have been, and again, the word that you used before in describing yourself as being disruptive, that you don't transform trauma if you're not disruptive. You don't
Yes,
transform trauma by just following the status quo. That
complacent. Yeah,
our state has a kind of a capacity and ability, and many of the schools that I've worked with have a level of bravery and courage that just say, this sounds good. Let's test it with the workforce. If you can sell the workforce on this, then we will commit the resources. The
wow.
the program that we offer is significantly less expensive than packaged. We really try to tailor it. We're a small outfit. We're a small little mental health agency in one of the smallest states in the United States. And so we have trusted that what sells the program is relationships,
Yeah,
as what changes the work that we have to do with kids and families is relationships. So we use our own medicine, and that the districts where this is really taking a footing is not the wealthiest districts. It's not the
yeah.
necessarily the most progressive. It's the ones that have allowed and enabled a relationship to develop between us and them, and a level of trust and regard to figure let's go through, because I'm not going to change it on my own. It's a partnership. It's a collaboration. It's a community, and that when we speak that language, there's often a lowering of any kind of defenses around
Hmm.
what you're going to do or what you're going to change or what you're going to ask of us.
Well, brilliant. I'm going to give you the list of quotes I have for you, what you
Okay.
have said, which needs to be framed all over my office. So, and I wish to really educate myself even more deeply to understand how to create communities, because I, as a creator of a EXQ and a curriculum in schools, I have a relationship with lots of districts and schools, and as we are expanding, I'm recognizing that just schooling in 21st century post COVID is not an easy process. So, Dave, I cannot thank you for your generous time, and thank you, listeners, for your patience. We did take a little bit extra time from you, but we meant to do that because, as you can see, Dave could have gone on for another 2 hours in depth, but I really appreciate your time. So that's all the time we have. Thank you deeply, Dave Melnick, for being my guest. As you can see, these are important conversations. And as you become knowledgeable and informed by our guests, we create communities where we share this common knowledge, which again becomes the impetus to change. So that's all the time we have. As usual, if you love what you are listening to, share with your colleagues, friends, and family. Please leave us a review. And we also will have this posted on YouTube in case you would like to see Dave and I bantering about this. So once again, thank you for joining in today. And let's see you again next time here at on Full Prefrontal.
Thank you, Sucheta.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.